Good morning and good afternoon to everybody. Welcome to our new webinar on within the framework of disinformation, which is organized by the European Foundation for Democracy in cooperation with the US mission to the EU. Today, our focus will be on Asia in general, but within the context of the pandemic. Our excellent speakers today will contribute to the exchange and to a conversation that will focus on, will examine the region itself, but as well as the broader implication and the role of China. We have today with us Ambassador Harry Tseng, the Taipei representative office in the EU and Belgium, Bonnie Glaser, the director of the China Power Project within the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and Roland Freudenstein, policy director at the Wilfried Martens Center for European Studies. We'll have an hour for this conversation. Our guest will start with some initial preliminary remarks, and we will then move to Q&A. For all those who are following us and are participating in the event, you can ask your questions by clicking on the Q&A section button at the bottom of your screen. Questions will be then reported to the guest speakers. I'm going to ask, start with Bonnie, and ask, as I said, a broader question to look at the region, to look at particularly the key regional players with attention on China. What we would like to discuss is what and how has changed what kind of power balance we have today. How has it been affected by the pandemic and the attention that has been brought onto China, but also what kind of risk and threat does China represent for its regional partners? Bonnie, thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Roberta. Thank you so much for the invitation to participate in this panel with such esteemed colleagues. I appreciate the opportunity from the European Foundation for Democracy and also the US mission to the EU. And I'm glad that you're doing this event so that we can talk about China's evolving role in the region. You know, in the first 6 months of 2020, as COVID-19 spread from China to the rest of the world, Chinese policy toward many countries in the region has become even more assertive than before. For example, Australia's call for an investigation into the origins of the coronavirus pandemic prompted Beijing to slap tariffs of more than 80% on Australian barley imports. They stopped importing beef from some of the large Australian exporters, and also cautioned Chinese students against returning to Australia to study. In the South China Sea, we've seen Chinese Coast Guard ships, one that sank a Vietnamese fishing boat. There's also been harassment against a Malaysian oil rig and its supply vessels that were operating in an area that Malaysia claims is part of its extended continental shelf. That's disputed not only with China, but also with Vietnam. And of course, very much in the news is an ongoing dispute between China and India over their undemarcated border. A clash took place just 2 weeks ago that involved casualties for the first time in more than 4 decades. And they reportedly involved Chinese soldiers using iron rods and batons with spikes. The PLA has moved more troops into the region, and some of what has occurred looks very much premeditated. The movement of troops by China anywhere in China requires the approval of the Central Military Commission. So we know that Xi Jinping, who heads the CMC, was involved in some way. And then I should also mention the East China Sea. Last May, there were 2 Chinese Coast Guard ships that chased a Japanese fishing boat in territorial waters around the Senkakus in the East China Sea. And I also want to mention Taiwan, where we've seen a real dramatic increase in the military exercises and activity by Chinese ships, and particularly Chinese aircraft. In the last 2 weeks alone, Chinese military aircraft have entered Taiwan's air defense identification zone 8 times. So I want to very quickly outline what I see as 3 factors that explain this new phase of Chinese foreign policy assertiveness. The first is Xi Jinping's push to turn crisis into opportunity and enhance China's influence globally. So we know that Xi Jinping visited Jiao Tong University in Xi'an in May, and he said, and I quote, "Great historical progress always happens after major disasters." China saw opportunity in '97 when the Asian financial crisis occurred. China had pledged not to devalue its currency, and it was able to gain and benefit from the crisis. And then more than a decade ago, we had the global financial crisis, and Beijing also benefited from that. It was a time when the Chinese saw that the relative decline of the United States would likely lead to an increase in their power and influence, and they capitalized on that. So COVID-19 is widely seen as presenting another opportunity for China to advance its interests. With China's relative success in stopping the spread of the pandemic domestically, Xi Jinping hopes to make progress in promoting his goal of leading global governance reform. The second factor, Beijing foreign policy assertiveness, arises from fear of other countries taking advantage of China at a time that it faces domestic challenges. So at least some of China's behavior is a preemptive strike against countries to head off efforts to take advantage of perceived Chinese weakness and attention to its domestic situation. Now, this factor may sound in contradiction with the first factor, which suggests greater Chinese confidence, but in my view, these are 2 sides of the same coin. Insecurity is always present in the Chinese domestic political system. Eradicating COVID-19 is a task that is connected to the CCP's, the Chinese Communist Party's political legitimacy. Moreover, the history of China's century of national humiliation has led to resolve that China never again be exploited by foreigners. And then the third and final factor, which is related, is that China's leadership seeks to divert attention away from the mistakes of the Chinese party in the early weeks of the coronavirus outbreak. There's ample evidence, of course, that there was criticism during the early weeks and the lockdown of Wuhan, when doctors tried to warn the public of the impending danger and were silenced. Many countries are blaming China for permitting the virus to spread outside its borders. And Beijing really does want to avoid a negative impact on its global reputation. So to this end, China's been employing mask diplomacy, trying to use its capability of producing large quantities of PPE, masks, and other protective equipment to exporting to many countries in a bid to boost its soft power and head off criticism. And other tactics that have been applied are disinformation and wolf warrior diplomacy. These tactics are intended to portray other countries as inferior to China in their handling of COVID-19. So China's increasing assertive foreign policy began well before the pandemic, but COVID-19 has been an accelerant. And what is noteworthy is that a growing number of countries are criticizing China's behavior and reassessing their relationships with China. We see this in many parts of the world, and we certainly see it in Europe, where more and more countries have opted in Europe not to include Huawei as a provider of 5G infrastructure, and that's just one example. So serious and legitimate concerns are being raised about the implications of China's growing influence. This is a new trend, and it is worth watching.
Thank you, Bonnie. Thank you for the very interesting summary and overview of an extremely complex scenario. There's many questions that I have, but I'll control myself. So I'd like to give the floor to Roland. for a bit more of a European perspective. Clearly, China is at the center of the COVID-19 crisis, and as Bonnie was saying, there's a lot more attention from both the member states and European institutions to the threat that China represents to our security interests. And interestingly, it was Monday, or as part of the EU-China Forum, there's been a very strong denunciation from Commission President von der Leyen, like highlighting the fact that China was responsible for cyber attacks against hospitals in Europe, which is astonishing, maybe not surprising, but yet it was a very strong response from the Commission. Roland, I stopped talking. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Roberta. Thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure to be with the European Foundation for Democracy and, of course, the U.S. mission. I would like to follow up on Bonnie's statement that in terms of China's power projection, the corona crisis, the corona pandemic has only reinforced trends that were existing before. And I think the same goes, by the way, for Europe's pushback or Europe's reaction. What you just quoted, Roberta, that the president of the European Commission, in unprecedented, clear language, talked about not only Chinese disinfo, but also Chinese cyber attacks against European hospitals. And I think that mainly in Czechia, but also in some other countries, that is indeed a new quality. A new quality to a trend, however, which had been there before. I would say the year when European discourse turned critical about China was 2017, in fact. And it has been getting more critical ever since. Of course, you will see that there are countries, there are lobbies, there are interest groups in Europe which see things differently and believe that not only are we unable to decouple from China, we should actually still seek friendship and partnership with China. So this is an open debate which is going on in Europe. But let me just briefly come to something else that happened before the pandemic started, and which was very telling about China's understanding of its role in the world. The so far only feature movie from China on Netflix is titled Wandering Earth. And indeed, I mean, almost literally, no, very literally, China moves planet Earth to a different location in the cosmos in order to save it. And this is China acting on behalf of humankind. Bonnie, you're smiling. I'm a science fiction buff, you know. Actually, I like the outset of the story, but the way it is put on screen, of course, is a highly self-righteous and at the same time self-confident, but also self-conscious approach to China's relationship with the rest of the world. And, you know, this indeed was only reinforced over the last couple of months. And if I go a little bit into detail here, what actually happened in Europe, we already mentioned the cyber attacks, the disinfo that had already increased during the Hong Kong protests of 2019. That was also the time when Chinese Chinese activists on social media, probably on the payroll of the Communist Party and its front organizations, started working in greater numbers in spinning certain narratives. And this again reinforced exponentially during the pandemic for the reasons that Bonnie outlined. Now, what was the European reaction to this? I think there is a willingness, even by the institutions of the European Union, to openly talk about this. We saw the affair in April and May when the External Action Service was putting out a report on disinfo during the pandemic, and wanted to, in the first draft, wanted to name China and give specific examples of Chinese disinfo about the pandemic and about Europe's reaction to it. And this was toned down after the initial draft was leaked. And the Chinese embassies protested. Chinese diplomats protested against the report. China still appeared in the final version, but the tone was definitely more moderate. Now, a second example happened a couple of days later. Within 10 days, like 2 examples of, if you want, censorship by the Chinese Communist Party of EU documents. And that was an article co-signed by the 27 ambassadors of the European Union in the China Daily, I think, where they celebrated 45 years of EU-China relations. And the article was generally pretty sycophantic already about China and the Chinese government. And it contained one sentence about the origin of the virus. And that sentence was taken out at the strong request of the Chinese Foreign Ministry. Now here, I mean, there wasn't even a defense of this in Brussels. There was a clear statement by Josep Borrell, the head of the External Action Service, that this should not happen again. And then we had the very strong statement by Ursula von der Leyen about cyber attacks against hospitals and disinfo. But what follows from it is very open. Whether any action happens that follows on these verbally strong statements, getting stronger over time, is the big question mark. And I think we might want to discuss this a little bit also in the context of transatlantic relations, whether we're going to see a difference. We already see a difference, but whether we are going to see maybe even controversy between Europe and the United States over China policy, or on the other hand, whether we're going to see more of a convergence and a kind of joint approach to China, which doesn't have to be identical. You know, the United States don't have to do exactly the same thing as the European Union, but which at least is coordinated in order to achieve more, because we are trying to achieve it together. So I think I'd like to leave it there, you know, from how Chinese actions have developed to the European reaction to the transatlantic angle, and leave it with this for the moment.
Thank you, Roland. You made very interesting remarks as well, and that we should definitely explore as a part of this conversation. I'd like to move to Ambassador Tseng. Ambassador, you, as representative of Taipei in Belgium and the EU, you find yourself in a very interesting position. Not only you are in Brussels and you hear what is going on, the discourse, whether it's changed and how it's changing, but you also come from the region, and you've seen firsthand how the various different geopolitical developments have impacted regional security, but also how Taiwan has managed to maintain a liberal democratic system, while at the same time dealing with the security threat in general, but most recently with the health security related to COVID-19. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the invitation from you, Roberta. And it's wonderful to be in the same panel with both my friends, Fanny and Roland. I was told to approach this subject from a geopolitical perspective and this is what I'm going to do. Well, I think most people would agree that this outbreak of coronavirus took everyone by surprise, including China. Even if it was a result of some kind of accident in a lab, it was perhaps most likely unintended, unexpected. When the epidemic became a worldwide crisis, and when every country is busy fighting COVID-19, I think maybe China is the only country that sees an opportunity and tries to take advantage of it. Well, you know that the Chinese translation of the word crisis is 危机. 危 is risk or danger. 机 is opportunity. When most of the countries in the world see only the first part of the crisis, danger in the pandemic, China sees an opportunity. Let us recall the legacy of Mao Zedong, which is never forgotten by the Chinese Communist Party, especially his very faithful follower, Mr. Xi Jinping. Mao Zedong's famous saying, 天下大乱, 形势大好, meaning the more chaotic the situation, the better the chance. I think this is the mindset of the Chinese leaders today. Well, the pandemic became an opportunity for the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, because it did not cause damage to China alone. It is jeopardizing the entire world. In the views of the CCP, there is a real potential this pandemic is going to topple the world order, which is dominated by the Western liberal democracy. And China wants to seize this opportunity to change the existing world order and wants to push its agenda, its China model, to the central part of a new world order. And I think only from this perspective can we make sense of what China has been doing in the recent months. Let's look back to April this year. Since April, when the coronavirus was largely contained and under control in China, while meanwhile, Europe and America became submerged in the pandemic and were suffering. China, on the one hand, offered medical assistance to many countries, and on the other hand, started to create all sorts of issues. Some of the issues were mentioned by Barney, and let me name a few. These troubles met by China include, number one, to blame other countries as origins of the coronavirus, starting from the US soldiers, and then Italy perhaps, and then Germany, and then some other countries. Number two, the Chinese wolf warrior diplomat accused their hosting countries of mishandling the pandemic. Number three, to instigate border conflict with India, which was mentioned by Barney. Number four, to strengthen its military fortification in the South China Sea, also mentioned by Barney, by using the armed fishing boats to harass Vietnam and the Philippines. Number five, intensified its air patrol around Taiwan and flying into Taiwan ADIZ, the Air Defense Identification Zone. Number six, to increase its activities near the Japan-controlled Senkaku Island. And most recently, number seven, initiating a new national security law to be imposed on Hong Kong. All above were taking place almost in the same frame of time. You cannot help but ask why on earth China are making troubles. We may be thinking that the Chinese Communist Party must be out of its mind making all kinds of troubles, make themselves very unpopular to the world. But the Chinese Communist Party leaders may believe that they are making advances towards their very important strategic goal. In fact, as the pandemic spread from Europe and America to the West, to the rest of the world, especially with the racial conflicts in the US adding to the complexity and even emulated in some other parts of the world. This worsening situation is what the CCP is happy to see. Remember what I just said. The more chaotic the situation, the better the chance. In crisis, when we think of how to mitigate the losses, the CCP thinks about how to enlarge the damage and then to utilize the losses in a way to benefit itself and to enhance its strengths. Then you may ask, why are there such differences in our response to the external environment? I think fundamentally it is because we have different views of the world. The CCPs think differently from the free world. And this is already said very clearly in the Chinese Communist Party's 19th Party Congress. When Xi Jinping said the essence of the conflict in China is between those people who are aspiring for a better life and those people who are having insufficient and unbalanced development in their life. This is domestically to describe the Chinese situation, but it also said in the political report, this internal conflict also reflected to the international situation. In other words, the conflict in the international community basically is the conflict between developed countries and undeveloped countries. This is why China always insists that it is undeveloped country under WTO. Because if they are recategorized into a developed country, it will be difficult for them to apply to their own party doctrine. Well, when we look at this, the grand framework of this world situation, we must say that the success of Taiwan and South Korea in fighting the COVID-19 is particularly important, as this is a case to show the strength and the validity of democracy. Well, I think my time is approaching the end, and I have others to say. I leave it to the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, all three of you. We start opening to questions. We have questions already received partly via Facebook or email. But before we do that, I'd like to come back to you, Ambassador. You made a very important remark, and that is we have different worldview. There is a different worldview and a different ideological perspective and ambition between Europe or between Western democracies on one side and China on the other. What would you expect from the European Union? How do you see what kind of possibility do you see to bridge this gap, this ideological gap, this worldview gap? At the time where on one hand, there's been very strong denunciations towards China from, we mentioned, European Union Commission President von der Leyen. France is also, as we heard, moving its investment. But at the same time, we have a country like Germany, was reported yesterday, that still has to make very big decisions because from their perspective, market, they don't want to give up. In fact, I say it to the ambassador, but please, all speakers do jump in.
Well, thank you, Roberta, for your question. I believe that this is the question for all of us. How should the EU face a different view of the world from China? I think this question can be rephrased as how should the Western world confront the PRC or the Chinese Communist Party? I think there is a fundamental weakness in the Western democracy, that is that we don't have enough understanding of the thinkings of the Chinese Communist Party. While on the other hand, China has a very good understanding of the thinking and the way of thinking, the way of action of the Western world. And China even knows very well the weakness of the liberal democracy and use their system to further exploit the weakness of the Western societies. Even though the EU leaders have gradually come to understand the threat of China, which is not potential, which is actually real and ongoing. Many leaders in EU said it has to come to an end of the naivety toward China. But the problem is, you know you should come to the end of naivety, but you don't know how, because you don't know how China thinks. And there is a lot of what China says doesn't make sense to a lot of people, to me, for example, but will be taken as plausible. For example, China said that they want to work with the EU to reform the WTO. But China was actually the country that violated the WTO rules in the past 20 years since they joined the WTO. How can you believe that China can work with the EU to reform the WTO when they have violated the WTO rules for the past 20 years? You don't take somebody's words for it, what they promised for, what they will behave tomorrow. You judge a person by what they did yesterday in the past, because that is the record. So the fact that you want to work with China to reform WTO is very strange to me. So I'm just raising this as an example. But I think it's a good idea that people will come to understand we are talking to someone whose view of the world is very much constrained by the party doctrine. The party doctrine in the Chinese Communist Party is very different. They see the world as a stage of struggle. Now, this is not a peaceful world for them. This is always a world of struggle. They are taking advantage of the system, but it is not well understood by the Western society.
Thank you, Ambassador. Roland, Bonnie, I'd like to, well, to my previous question, I'd like to also add, how would you see what the ambassador has just described? Is it denial from Europeans or Americans? Is it greed, says that market is more important? Is it realpolitik? Why? How could it be that we continue being on a collision course in our relation with China or other authoritarian systems?
Okay, if I may start, and let me limit my remarks to Europe for the moment. There certainly is a degree of complacency. There is of course the illusion that the immediate material benefit of intense economic relations with China is sustainable, which in my view it isn't. And again, there has been a process in Europe and even in Germany, a process of a slow recognition of this fact over the last couple of years. I mean, when a year and a half ago, the German Federation of Industries came out with a paper, a strategy paper on China, which like almost literally started with a sentence. The Chinese Communist Party is a threat to liberal democracy, open society, and the social market economy. I think that was a watershed moment for German business, for Germany, and for many Europeans. This was unexpected, and I have myself witnessed how Chinese officials got riled by this shift in the organization of German business in January 2019. So, you know, there is a growing recognition, even by, and especially by corporations that do business with China, that we do not have an even playing field, a level playing field, that China is taking advantage, interpreting, misusing existing rules for its own advantage, and that not every business project with Chinese is win-win. In fact, many of them are win for China, lose for the West. So this is slowly sinking in now. And I absolutely agree to what Harry said about our knowledge base and our analytical capacity about China. That is insufficient. And here, Europe, continental Europe looks worse than Britain, by the way. Brexit also implies that 50% of the China knowledge in the European Union has left in terms of experts, in terms of institutes and so on, Mandarin speakers. And the United States also looks better than continental Europe. So continental Europe has much to catch up. And I think we urgently, direly need an independent knowledge base about China that is not financed by the Confucius Institute or other front organizations of the Chinese Communist Party. So in an analytical capacity, the recognition that economic relations with China are not a level playing field, and we have to at least try to shift them in this direction. We have to reduce dependence on China, and this goes for pharma, as we've seen, pharmaceuticals, as we've seen in the pandemic, but also in terms of high technology. And the 5G question comes to mind, that was already mentioned. More and more European countries indeed do not want to have Huawei equip their 5G networks. Germany is still sitting on the fence about this, but my prediction is that it's a question of time until the Huawei question is also negatively answered in Germany itself. Finally, I think, why is it that Europe is so slow? I mean, as I said, there is some development, but Europe is still behind the curve, I would say, collectively. That is because Europeans have particular difficulty in seeing the world in hard power terms, right? I mean, you know, ever since Bob Kagan in 2003 talked about of paradise and power, that was his essay, later his book. Europeans are from Venus, Americans are from Mars, Chinese are from Pluto or somewhere. But the fact is that Europeans still have a problem in seeing that sometimes you need to confront antagonists in this world. You know, when the European strategy on China last March was published, defining China as in some areas a partner, in some areas a competitor, and in some areas a systemic rival. Again, alarm bells went ringing in Beijing. But you know, coming back to the European philosophy here, you cannot build a relationship on such diverse basis. You cannot trustfully cooperate with a country which is your systemic rival, including cyber attacking hospitals. That is just not possible. And I think, again, this is slowly sinking in Europe. Another big problem for the Europeans is consensus, is unity. 27 member states We barely managed to maintain unity on sanctions against Russia, for example. We are far away from any unified reaction, besides words, of course, but any real hardcore reaction to, for example, what China is doing about Hong Kong, clearly violating international commitments. And then there is finally this delusion, I would say, in Europe about having to place oneself somewhere on this binary scale between the US and China, and that Europe can play a role of its own or maintain some kind of equidistance here. That is a delusion, because the real conflict in future is not between two powers. It is between two different ways of seeing the world in terms of democracy. This is freedom versus authoritarianism. And here Europe is not alone with the US, but fortunately in the good company of countries like Canada, Australia, Britain, of course, and not to forget many neighbors of China itself, including, of course, above all, Taiwan.
Thank you, Roland. Bonnie, the transatlantic perspective, clearly there's the response we've heard from the US was strong and vocal. Do you see this as a potential crisis or increased tension between America and Europe, or do you see this as a temporary situation, but in fact reflecting on the shared liberal democratic values?
Well, I think if you look at the U.S. reaction over the last several years to China, in many ways it has been unilateralist. It has been inconsistent. There has been a lot of confrontational rhetoric, but not necessarily effective and coherent and strategic response. I credit the Trump administration with having clearly recognized some of the threats that China poses to the United States, to American interest, and to democracies all around the world. And there have been some areas where there has been some effective responses, such as, for example, intellectual property espionage is an area that has received a great deal of focus and more resources has been put to it. But I fail to see an overall strategy from the Trump administration. Particularly, we can see, if any of our listeners have read recent reporting about the new book that the former National Security Advisor, John Bolton, has written, that highlights many incidents in which President Trump did not pursue a policy or a particular effort that was consistent with other things that the administration was doing. So what really needs to be done, not just in the United States, but also in Europe, and as Ambassador Tseng said, across the West, is to first make our countries more resilient, our systems more resilient. We should not be vulnerable to cyber attacks. We should ensure that our institutions cannot be penetrated. We should educate our people about China and understand what the risks are. We should protect our companies and investment in our countries. That doesn't mean not having any Chinese investment, in my view, but it means making sure that we review investments before they take place, or takeovers of companies. We have to make sure that areas that are pertinent to national security, that may be pharmaceuticals now as well, not just telecommunications. And then the second thing that we need to do is coordinate more effectively. Beijing does try to drive a wedge between countries, single out individual countries and put pressure on them. And so we do need to work together. That's not only, of course, difficult between and among the member states of the EU, but really all of the democracies. We've seen in the G7 a recent statement that was put out where we jointly condemn what the Chinese are doing in Hong Kong. But we know that there are a lot of divisions among many of the Western countries on how to approach China. So we do need to have better coordination in order to advance common interests and protect our democracies.
Thank you, Bonnie. Thank you all. Let me take a few questions from our participants. Nejin Mengu was actually asking the same things, but I want to repeat it for the records, and you partly answered, Bonnie, and that is, so was the President Trump right in a way in anticipating the crisis, or being so loud on how to deal with even the business economic exchanges? And another participant asked, so again, is how do you view the future of EU-China relations beyond COVID-19 crisis? I'll try and summarize it. So future relations between EU and China beyond COVID-19. In what ways has China used the COVID-19 crisis to open new doors and spread influence in Taiwan and other Asian countries? Ambassador, that's for you. What is whether there's an interest on a chance for Taiwan in the WHO? And then I continue with others. Please, maybe Ambassador, you can share with us about your views on what kind of tactics has China used to even spread its influence in Taiwan. We're very familiar now with disinformation is the buzzword of the last few months, and we've been at the receiving end of that. But what does it mean for Taiwan?
I think for Taiwan, we have been very pragmatic. We try to play within the political realities. That means a lot. That means we don't and we work with the world, trying to offer them our perspective of how things are happening in China, in our part of the world, and hoping that our voice can be heard. When I said what I have shared with you, it may be new to some of the listeners, but if you read into the Chinese party's documents, it doesn't have to be confidential documents. Many articles published in their party magazines like 求是, like Seeking Truth, or the political report of Xi Jinping on the party's 19th Party Congress. There's a lot of information there. It's only that you need to know how to read between the lines to know what message was kept there. If you are just reading them like reading a newspaper, you miss all the important point. So how to discern from those available documents and to know what is exactly China has in mind in their grand strategy? That's the key. Let me say this. The most important message in the 19th Party Congress, I mention this because this is really a watershed event. The Chinese strategy toward the world has a distinct difference before and after the 19th Party Congress. And in the Party Congress, China pointed out the two centennials. And by the 2050, they want to accomplish a so-called grand 伟大民族复兴, grand restoration or grand revitalization of China by 2050. Look, there is a speech by Xi Jinping. He gave the speech in the Central Party School on the 3rd of September last year, 2019. It's even before the pandemic. He said, to achieve the goal of the grand restoration of China, it is not by easygoing feasts or festivals. It is by the great struggle. Look, struggle, 斗争. This is the essence of the international relations. This is always in the gene of the Chinese Communist Party. Every move has a very clear focus on where they want to go in the future. If Xi Jinping said it, that it is only through great struggle they can achieve the 2 centennials. One is on 2021, which is next year. One is 2049. Okay, that would mean they would, of course, take advantage of all possible opportunities the world and move and advance toward their strategic goal, which is to be the leader in the world, because obviously the current liberal democracy, this world order is created after the end of the Second World War, dominated by the US power. Of course, this is a fact. China doesn't like that. China wants a China model in a new world, and they wouldn't abandon any opportunity for them to make advance. As for Taiwan, Taiwan's value is, we know China very well, because we used to be in one country before 1949. There is a party in Taiwan, the KMT, Nationalist Party, who had real experience in conflict with the Communist Party before 1949. They know how China, the Communist Party, would use the tactics of negotiating when they are in the weak point, and then make advance when they are strong. They are doing this all the time. And so use Taiwan, use the strengths of Taiwan. I think it will be to the benefit of the Western world. And the way to do it is to invite Taiwan to join the international forum. If not, if the time is not ripe for an open forum, like in the WHO or the UNFCCC or what you have, bilateral approach would be also welcome. We in Taiwan welcome the countries in the world to reach out to us. We never say no. So sorry, I'm using too much time. I want to let my friends to say a lot of other things you have.
No, it's perfect. Actually, there is a question that just come in for Roland, and links very much to what you just said, Ambassador. And the question is, what are the similarities and differences between Russia and China in terms of threats? Is threats better understood? Are we do we have that knowledge about Russia that the Ambassador mentioned before?
Well, we know in the European Union and here in Brussels, I think we at least would like to believe we understand Russia better than we understand China, but that doesn't mean that we always find the right answer, even vis-a-vis Russia. Now, what are the differences? I think the point of departure is different between Russia and China. I think Russia has basically, under Putin, given up any hope, if they ever had any, of kind of being a model, a positive, a city upon a hill for the rest of the world. I mean, you know, Putin's outlook is cynical. Ultimately, he wants to stay in power as long as possible. He knows that the only threat to this would be a democracy movement in Russia, and he knows that for a democracy movement in Russia, a successful rule of law and successful economies, market economies in the countries of the former Soviet Union would be extremely helpful for a democracy movement in Russia. So he needs to destroy that. He needs to undermine neighboring democracies, such as Ukraine, such as Georgia, and so on. And in order to achieve that, he has to weaken and even if possible, destroy organizations like the European Union and NATO. Now, China's approach, point of departure initially is a bit different still. It is, I would say, much more hopeful that China can actually become some kind of model for the world. This is, we've heard this time and time again from Xi Jinping, the Chinese dream. We've seen this reinforced in the pandemic. China's way of managing this was supposed to be an example to others. And we see this in Chinese discourse about the rest of the world. Now, the interesting thing is that if you look at the instruments with which China operates, there has been a real convergence, especially in terms of corruption, elite capture, as it's called, buying people, essentially. And also in terms of social media and using trolls, using social media activists to sow disinformation. Here, China has taken a page from Russia's textbook in the last year or so. But I would still see some essential differences between the two approaches. Doesn't make it easier for us.
No, because the question is beyond the security hierarchy or security leadership in Europe, as in the United States. What is the public perception of China, particularly when it comes to the economy, the business dimension of the relationship? Bonnie, from your perspective, from Washington, actually is a question that applies to all again. What do you think, how do you think the EU and the United States can help and support Taiwan, being one of the few, not the only one, but one of the few liberal democratic systems in the region?
Well, let me cite a few things that I think that that the EU and the United States can do. Despite the fact that the Trump administration has had a good relationship with Taiwan since coming into power, we've seen a strengthening of diplomatic relations, some higher level contacts. We've seen closer military relations. But we have really not seen progress in the sphere of economics and trade. And this has been, I think, a mistake, because economic prosperity is so inextricably linked to security. And as regional trade agreements progress in the region, we see the CPTPP, which Japan really took over the finish line, and that has now come to fruition. The RCEP is still in progress, but Taiwan is not part of either of these agreements, and neither is the United States. And so what we can do is negotiate agreements with Taiwan, either in the investment sphere or a free trade type agreement. There are certainly problems that need to be dealt with, but these are not insurmountable obstacles, either in the US economic relationship with Taiwan or in the EU relationship with Taiwan. And then secondly, I think in the area of international participation for Taiwan, there again, I think has been very small progress in this first term of the Trump administration, even though there has been a lot of rhetorical support. And so as Ambassador Tseng talked about, the achievements that Taiwan has made in combating and controlling COVID-19 provides irrefutable evidence and that Taiwan deserves to be part of the World Health Organization. We know that Taiwan was, in fact, an observer to the World Health Assembly for 8 years. It has really not been since 2017 or late 2016. And this is only because China has blocked Taiwan's participation and observership. So this is where we should start. And then we should look at other international organizations. Interpol is representation in, and I know that Taiwan's government has also pushed for representation in the International Civil Aviation Organization. So where a case can be made that Taiwan can bring something to the table, can contribute to an organization, as well as its 23 million people benefit from being part of that organization, then I think that we should push for greater participation for Taiwan. So that's just a few suggestions.
Thank you. Very, very helpful, very, very important. Ambassador, what, from your perspective, what do you think Europe can do, and how can Taiwan be supported more effectively, I would say?
I want to thank Bonnie for putting a very condensed and very good way those that I haven't said in my remarks. I think the international participation is very important to Taiwan. And now after the COVID-19, the pandemic, I think Taiwan has approved that we can make our due contribution if the world is thinking about reforming the WHO. We were not invited to the World Health Assembly in May. There is going to be another conference by the WHO sometime in November. I hope this is the opportunity for Taiwan to be invited and to share our experience. Bonnie has mentioned the CPTPP. This is of top significance to Taiwan. Here in Europe, we have a similar project that we regard very important to us. This is the bilateral investment agreement between EU and Taiwan. Right? We very much hope that this BIA can go on. Now, it has been the policy of the EU, but it hasn't initiated real negotiation yet. Very much hope that this can change. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. We have one final question from the audience. Tommaso Virgili asked, which diplomatic rapprochement can European countries and the US undergo with Taiwan to strengthen their relationship against China? Any perspective of full recognition? Anything that, any perspectives of full recognition?
Well, I guess it's complicated. And additionally to the problems I outlined before about the unity within the European Union and the still widely different points of view on China, for the moment, all EU member states, and certainly the EU collectively, stick to the so-called one China principle. In other words, considering China one nation, including Taiwan. And for that to change, I'm afraid China would have to get even more aggressive than it is at the moment. That is pretty much set in stone. So what could happen and should happen is what Harry and Bonnie just outlined, is below the level of diplomatic recognition, to see how can we, like to borrow a word from old communist rhetoric, in salami tactics, how to change the status quo and formalize relations with Taiwan below the level of diplomatic recognition. That's the realistic perspective for the moment. And it would be, I think it would already be an achievement if we could, in the EU, among the member states, agree that we want to gradually shift our position in these matters.
Thank you.
May I add to that just one minute? Well, before the EU member state can change their one China policy, I urge them to rethink their one China policy. Because there is no fit definition of one China policy. It's up to you to decide what kind of relationship you can establish with Taiwan. While this is the case, the Chinese government is increasingly trying to replace the phrase one China policy by their so-called one China principle. I would urge the member state not to use one China principle because China is the only country use the term one China principle. So there is only one definition given by China, which is Taiwan is part of China and Taiwan is a province of the PRC. Well, you don't need to take that kind of definition into your one China policy. You can develop your relations with Taiwan without too much fear from China, especially when you are doing this collectively.
Thank you. Thank you to all our speakers. Would you like, we're reaching we're past the hour for the duration of our webinar. Would you like to do, do you have any additional final conclusive remarks? Anything that we've missed to say or to ask? I see silence from our speakers.
One thing is just to rub it in that the big conflict, global conflict of the future is authoritarianism versus liberal democracy. And this is fought on many fronts, on many levels. It's also inside the European Union, inside the West, that Democrats have to fight that struggle. But it is, globally speaking, to a very, very high degree, a struggle between the Chinese Communist Party and most of the rest of the world. And we need to win this.
Thank you, Roland. Actually, I couldn't agree more with you. I generally do, but I completely agree with this. We need to win this. So on behalf of the European Foundation for Democracy, I would like to thank you all. Thank you to our speakers for joining from both sides of the Atlantic, even if not physically yet. And thank you to our participants.